Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this important briefing organized by the Alliance for Cuban Engagement and Respect, also known as ACERE, which is about the coolest acronym you will find in the nonprofit world. We are a coalition advocating for a shift in U.S. policy towards Cuba, opposing broad sanctions as a response to long-standing ideological and political conflicts. Members share the simple belief that engagement and respect towards Cuba and its people, rather than the restrictive measures and aggressive rhetoric, are the key to fostering positive relations between these two nations. My name is Jorge Quintana, and I'm honored to be moderating today's discussion. Just briefly, as way of introduction, I'm an elections attorney here in Washington, D.C. Before that, I proudly represented Montana on the Democratic National Committee, as vice chair of the Hispanic Caucus, and on the Resolutions Committee. My parents left Cuba in the early 60s. Soy hijo del exilio, and I still have family there. I like to call myself a Yuma Santiaguero. Besides that, I've been deeply involved in U.S.-Cuba relations, advocacy, and have organized delegations to Cuba. Now, as a political animal, there are certain dates on the calendar that have always, for anyone immersed in U.S.-Cuba politics, have become landmarks. For me, two of those, the first one being the UN General Assembly yearly vote to condemn the embargo that the United States has maintained for 6 decades now. It's a moment that captures global sentiment and reflects how isolated the U.S. is on this issue. Spoiler alert, earlier this week, the 32nd consecutive resolution was passed with overwhelming support, 187-2, with only the United States and Israel opposing. The second highly anticipated event on a biannual basis is the release of the FIU U.S.-Cuba poll, a barometer of evolving attitudes within the Cuban-American community. It provides critical insights into how perspectives have shifted and are shifting over time, and sheds light on the policy preferences of our demographic. These moments remind us of both of these moments remind us of the impact that both public opinion and political calculations have on the relations between the United States and Cuba. So today, standing at the doorstep of the 2024 U.S. presidential election, we will discuss the poll as well as some electoral considerations in Florida. As we know, for more than 6 decades, the Cuban-American community in Miami has had quite the influence on U.S. foreign policy towards Cuba. With all of this in mind, we are privileged to have an expert panel joining us today. First, let me introduce Dr. Guillermo Grenier. He's a professor of sociology at Florida International University, a leading authority on Cuban-American, let's say the leading authority on Cuban-American public opinion, and has spearheaded the FIU Cuba poll for decades. His extensive research has provided valuable insights into the shifting political and cultural dynamics of the Cuban-American community. Next, we have Dr. Bill Leogrand. He's a professor of government at American University, a renowned expert on U.S.-Cuba relations with numerous publications and books on the subject. His expertise includes the historical context of policy decisions and their implication for contemporary politics. And third, Dr. Ernesto Dominguez, a visiting professor at Stanford's University Center for Latin American Studies. He brings a rich understanding of both the Cuban and U.S. perspectives on bilateral relations. His academic focus has been on public opinion and international relations, which will add depth to our analysis of current policy trends. Following their presentations, we'll open the floor for questions and discussions. Feel free to plug them into the chat as we're going along. Before I hand it over, thank you to the staff at ACERE. Another job well done. So with that, I will hand it off to Guillermo.
Thank you, Jorge. I'm sharing my screen here. Let's see if I can get it going. You see that?
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Jorge. Thank you, ACERE, for inviting me, and I really am honored to be on the same panel as Bill Ilgran and my colleague from Cuba. Um, all right, so I'm going to be quick here because we only have X number of minutes, but I encourage you to look for the entire uh, Cuba poll, which is at the cri.fiu.edu website. You can download the whole thing, and it has many more variables that I'm going to be able to talk about in the next 10 minutes. But I want to focus on some of the key elements of the poll that some expected results, such as the voting patterns of Cuban Americans, but also some new results that have made me look at at our endeavor of the Cuba poll differently, and I'll get into that in a second. The First, I'm going to contextualize the Cuban population in South Florida in terms of by the numbers, because part of the background that we have in this for our marching orders in this webinar is to kind of think about the Cuban American vote and its impact locally, and to what degree it's a national impact. By the numbers, Cuban Americans in the United States are a minuscule percentage of the population, less than 1%. In Florida, we are 7%, a little over 7% of the population. In Miami-Dade County, you can see that Cubans, other Hispanics, and non-Hispanics kind of break up the ethnic spectrum, if you categorize them like that, pretty much in thirds. And so Cubans are the largest solid ethnic group. They're also the largest voting group in Miami-Dade County. Now, in terms of registrations, you can see here, these are numbers that are solid numbers. Well, solid in the sense that they come from the voter registration rolls in the state of Florida and Miami-Dade County. The estimates are the Cuban vote, Cuban estimates, and we do that by estimating Hispanic participation and then Cuban participation from other polls, and including our own. So you can see that in the state where you have almost 14 million registered voters, 500,000 of those are Cuban Americans. In Miami-Dade County, which is the largest concentration, of course, of Cuban Americans, you have over a large majority there. That is, in the whole state, there are only 700,000 registered Cubans. In Miami-Dade County, you have 500 some thousand. In the Republican row here, you can see that Cuban Americans are mostly Republicans, less than 100,000, 89,000 Democrats in the Miami-Dade County, 124 in the entire state. So those are the numbers, all right? And then from now on, we're going to be talking about percentages of those numbers. So you might want to, I don't know, keep those in mind. Now, voter registrations, this is basically this last row, this last column, made more clear. That is, you have Cubans are 55% of Cubans in Miami-Dade County are Republican or registered Republicans. Over a quarter of Cubans are independents, no party affiliations, and then a small, I would say, percentage are Democrats. Now, that small percentage has varied over time, and I'll show you that in a second, but this is where we're sitting right now. When the Republicans end up losing lowering their numbers in Miami-Dade County, the winning category is not Democrats. The Cubans go from being Republicans to being independent over the years. That's been the flow. Other Hispanics, 20% are Republicans, almost 50% are independent, no party affiliations, and about a third are Democrats. Non-Hispanics, you have 50% Democrats and a smaller percentages, but still a substantial percentage consider themselves independent. So those are the numbers. Now, how do those numbers line up for the results that we're all waiting for next week? Well, the party registration, like I mentioned, is 55%. But you can see here, this is now Cuban Americans, right? This is from the latest poll, which is 1,000 randomly picked individuals in Miami-Dade County from lists. The randomness allows us to use probability, so you can look at a 3%, 3 plus or minus percentage points of margin of error. But you can see that the old guard Cuban Americans are staunchly Republican. And here's the 50% mark, right? So you only have the non-Cuba borns are the ones that spread the spectrum out, the ideological spectrum somewhat. The 50% mark is only crossed by the youngest voters, which are a quarter Democrat and a quarter independent, and the second and third generation Cuban Americans. They do look more like a swath of the United States in terms of party affiliation. Now, this party affiliations over time, I want to put it into context because it's 55% is a little bit more than last time, but within a margin of error, who knows? The Republicans, whether they're gaining registrations or not, it's almost a moot point in Miami-Dade County because it's a densely Republican messaging environment. But Republicans are going up, nothing close to what they were right before the Obama years began. But you'll notice that the independents maintain a healthy presence, and the Democrats don't seem to benefit a whole lot from the shifts in the winds, ideological winds. Now, the horse race, I'm going to first talk about the horse races, the Senate race, and then the presidential race, of course. No big surprises, although I was kind of a little surprised at the fact that Rick Scott's not feeling all the love that usually Cuban Americans bestow on him. I think it's primarily because nobody's paying attention to that race a whole lot. Look at the 22% undecided. This is a month that we ended asking these questions about 3 weeks ago. So we're looking at the poll closed October 9th and October 10th, around there. So you're looking at 22% undecided heading into the last month of the election cycle. That's quite a big number. So that probably will be a down ballot decision that will go into the red slot most likely. But again, here you see in the non-Cuba born Cuban Americans, the ones that are born elsewhere, it could be Miami, it could be other countries, it could be wherever. There is a more, they spread out their voting preferences a little bit more. You have over a third voting for Mukasey Powell, and then about a third for Rick Scott. There are in the Republican and Democratic ranks, there are defections, but still look at these very large undecided percentages. So it's, if you're going to call the Las Vegas line is that Rick Scott's going to win, and you probably will win some money if you get anybody to take a bet on ex-Congresswoman Mukasey Powell. Now, the elections for president is no surprise. Like I said in the presentation, the Trump train continues to pick up passengers on 8th Street, and 68%. And people say, "Wow, that's high." Yeah, but if you combine a couple of known facts, Cuban Americans vote Republican mostly, so there's no surprise in that the Republicans getting the majority of the votes. I mean, we've had Obama flirted with 40% percentage points, but see, nobody does polls after the elections. The ultimate poll is the elections. So we just have exit polls. We don't have, we have to take those with a considerable grain of salt. But in the 68% number, you have a couple of things that are working here. The fact that most Cubans vote Republican, and then there is what I like to call a Trump factor, which I wish I could stick a number on it and get and sell it. But I don't know what the Trump factor is. But clearly, if you had run any Republican for this in this slot, you would be getting 60-some%. Mitt Romney got almost 60%. He wasn't the best candidate against Obama at his height. McCain got 65%. So the fact that the Cubans are going Republican with Trump is not a surprise. The fact that it's Trump is what people are amazed at, or chagrined by, or whatever. But Trump's a Republican. He is a strong Republican candidate. So there's no surprise there. And then you can see that only, again, the non-Cuba born seem to toy with the idea of being bipartisan here. All right, so we did ask who they voted for in the last presidential election. Again, you see 63% voted for Trump. So there you have a 65 to 68 right now. It does not seem like a ridiculous number to predict Trump getting up from the Cuba vote, the Cuban Americans. These 8% are folks that did not vote in the last election, were not citizens in the last election to vote. They come into the polarized political environment that we have, and are voting this time around. So, what do Cuban Americans want? Sounds like a movie. First, I'm going to talk about national issues, and you can see here that the top three issues, the left-hand side, the columns that are somewhat separated from the rest of the columns, are the total for the entire population. That's plus or minus 3%. Those are the numbers. So and these are means. These are average. So we average the totals out. So you can see the economy, healthcare, and immigration are the top three issues for the entire population. And now, if you're looking at the age categories, you see that the top three stay the top three. What moves around somewhat are the other policies. And the little lightning rod here is on the purple, a lightning strike is on the purple category, and that's Cuba policy. You can see that Cuba policy never cracks the top four for any age group. And so when what Cuban wants is what Cuban Americans want is what a lot of non-Cuban Americans want, right? They want, they're concerned about the economy, healthcare, and the issue of immigration, even though they tell us they're immigrants. Now, if you look at the wave of migration, I'm going to be quick on this, but you can see the top three remain the top three, except for the non-Cuba born ones. The second and third generation are pushing up the issue of the economy, what is it, abortion, right? Abortion rights to a higher level. And then the earliest arrivals are concerned about race relations more than the general population. That's by migration. Now, party affiliation, this is the interesting one because you have a completely different agenda among Democrats than among the rest of the Cuban American population. Democrats push health care to number one. They push abortion rights to number two, and they push gun control to 4, right up there. So you have these concerns that are very different than the Republican concerns. And also one thing that you might want to look at, and this is like the future, is the non-citizens, right? The folks that cannot yet vote. their agendas right now are very similar, are more similar to Democratic agendas, Democratic Party agendas than to Republican agendas. Of course, everybody has their top three, but then the non-citizens push up again race relations and gun control into the 4 and 5. And then again, the Cuba policy thing is kind of like, yeah, if you ask us about Cuba, we'll talk about Cuba, and these are my answers on Cuba, but it's not their priority in any sense of the word. All right, this is something that I want to kind of hang in there, put in your brain somewhere. When you ask, because the category is here, the importance of leadership. The importance of leadership in establishing, in influencing the Cuban American population. When you ask about the embargo, for example, do you have a majority of folks that still are against the embargo? No surprise, it's always been that way. We've never gotten it below, except for the Obama years, and I'll talk about that in a second. It's always been a constant majority interest in keeping the embargo. Again, the non-Cuba born and the younger Cubans are somewhat more have a diverse view on that issue, and are more opposing the continuation of the embargo. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, there we go. Now, what I wanted to show here, because I know we're short on time, is that the influence of leadership in influencing the Cuban American population. We always think that the Washington responds to the Cuban American needs, but the Obama years showed very clearly that if you change the rules of the game, Cubans will follow. They'll just, I mean, they won't change their attitude towards the Cuban government. They'll still desire for the change in the Cuban government. They'll keep those attitudes, but now they're working with different rules in order to reach their goal of somehow delegitimizing the Cuban government. So you have and the red line here is the support for the embargo that has been 60 when Obama came in, but it's been as high as 87% in 1991 when we started the poll. It went down into the 60s with Clinton and stayed that way throughout until Obama came in and changed the rules of the game. At that point, the support for the embargo went down to 34% by the time he was leaving office, and the Trump years raised again, put the slant on the slope, and the inactivity of Biden on any kind of policy, cohesive policy towards Cuba, has pretty much kept it support for the embargo pretty high. Now the institutional opinion of favoring diplomatic relations, I mean, that's a big deal. You can have opinions about the embargo, but in order for diplomatic relations to be established, you have to have a decision by the state, of the United States. And that, again, went up during the Obama years and has now been, the interest in maintaining diplomatic relations has somewhat waned. So that's what we mean by when we talk about, and Professor LeGrand also has raised the issue of leadership mattering, being important, and that's a graphic illustration of how it is. Now, there's what do Cubans want? Well, they want, here's something that they want. They want U.S. policy to be directed specifically to improve the economic well-being of Cuban people. You can see that is a lot of blue there, right? Except for the oldest generation. A lot of blue. Everybody's in support of that. Not everybody, of course, but there's a majority support for policies that directed specifically to improve the economic well-being of Cuban people. Now, there's more support by the numbers, but an equal amount of support for policies that maximize pressure on the Cuban government to promote political change. Now, people say, well, we've been looking at these data as an either or. You're either one or the other. No, Cuban Americans want both. They want it's a challenge to policymakers, but they want both. They want policies that tighten the screws on the Cuban government and help the Cuban people. it should not be a dichotomous choice where you send your loved ones on the island down the tubes just because the policy enforces it only because policies are only designed to squeeze the Cuban government. Now, I was going to end here, and I know I probably should, but there is another slide that I want to put up here, because we also asked the whole issue of the private sector in Cuba, of course, is a contested terrain. It's it's not just 11,000 people aren't all related to the top echelons of the Cuban government. 11,000 small businesses aren't all run by folks that are tied to either the Communist Party or the Cuban government. Impossible in a way. But we asked whether the issue of the private sector in Cuba, if you would support a Republican candidate who advanced policies to assist the private sector on the island. And here you see quite a bit of blue, except against the oldest generation does not jump on board. But here you see that Republicans, over 50%, would support a Republican candidate that comes up with that kind of policy and idea. Independents, over 50% support that as well. The Democrats, 38% will cross party lines to support a Republican with that idea. We asked the same question about Democratic candidates and got less support, but at the same time, you can see that in my view, we're living in a Republican world for the foreseeable future, and so this number for me was a surprise on the one hand, but also perhaps people can think out of the box. Policymakers can think out of the box and figure out policies that do both, support the Cuban people and squeeze the Cuban government. The creation of a vibrant private sector in Cuba, any sociologist will tell you that change occurs when people have something and want more. And creation of a private sector in Cuba, if you're interested in seeing the government change its spots, is as good a way as any to do that, and probably better than what we've been trying for the last 60 years. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I will say that every time this comes out, one of the things I've always appreciated is the crosstabs, the amount of information you can glean from once you get past the top number. So I would echo the earlier advice to go look at the poll for yourself. There's an incredible wealth of data in there. Earlier, I said to put your questions in the chat. I meant the Q&A. Sorry about that, but go ahead and if questions come to mind, put them in your in the Q&A box. With that, we will now turn to Dr. Leogrand. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you to ACERE for putting this panel together. It's always a treat to see the new FIU poll and see how the community is moving, or in recent years not moving so much. But I want to talk about the political influence that the community has had. The rise of the Cuban-American lobby in national American politics really starts with President Ronald Reagan. He and his administration helped to mobilize Cuban Americans as a source of support for Reagan's Central America policy. And the Republican Party was on the ground, organizing in the Cuban American community, as Professor Grenier has written about, and the Democrats were not. And they really allowed the Republicans to get a jump on them with this constituency, and they've never really caught up. The first Democrat who really tried to compete politically for the Cuban American vote was Bill Clinton, first in 1992 by supporting the Cuban Democracy Act, and in 1996 he supported the Helms-Burton legislation because he was basically told by his political advisors that that was essential for his reelection. Now, Clinton failed to carry Florida in 1992, but he did carry it in 1996, and it was the Cuban American vote that made the difference. It was that close in Florida in 96. Although Clinton would have been reelected even if he'd lost Florida, because he had that big of advantage in the Electoral College. But then, of course, comes the nightmare election for Democrats. Al Gore loses Florida in 2000 and the White House by 537 votes because Cuban Americans cast what they called the punishment vote, because Bill Clinton's administration sent 6-year-old Elian Gonzalez back to his father in Cuba. And the Democrats have still never forgotten that trauma. They, for years, and I would even argue to this day, see Cuba as a kind of third rail of politics in Florida, and even the third rail of politics nationally when it comes to presidential elections. They're still haunted by that experience. But the fact of the matter is, Florida is very rarely decisive in presidential elections. And the Cuban American vote is very rarely decisive in Florida because the margins are often not small enough that the Cuban American electorate can be the difference. So, some numbers. There have been 16 presidential elections since Fidel Castro rode into Havana in 1959. Florida has been the decisive state only twice, in 2000 and in 2004. The Cuban American vote in Florida has only been decisive 3 times. That is to say, the difference between the Democrat and the Republican in Florida has only been small enough 3 times for the Cuban American electorate to make the difference. In 1992, as I mentioned, actually, it was 1992, not 96, excuse me. Clinton lost Florida, but he won the election anyway. In 2000, Al Gore lost everything. And in 2012, Obama won Florida, but he would have won it even without the Cuban American, or he even would have won the election even without having won Florida. So there's really only one election since 1959 where the Cuban American electorate decided the outcome in Florida, and Florida decided the presidency. So what about today? Well, as Professor Grenier explained, Cuban Americans are predominantly Republicans. They vote like Republicans. And the Cuba issue is not even all that high on their agenda. And I think that the very last slides that we saw show you that when you put forward the same policy proposal, support the private sector, if it's a Republican putting it forward, it gets strong support from Cuban Americans. If it's a Democrat putting it forward, it gets way less support. And that's just a measure, really, of the fact that Cuban Americans are Republicans, and they vote like Republicans, and they prefer Republican candidates almost regardless of the issue. So the other problem for the Cuban American lobby and its influence is that Florida is not a swing state anymore. And it probably hasn't been a swing state for several presidential elections. You'll notice that neither candidate has been campaigning in Florida. Neither candidate has been talking about Cuba as a political issue. And to me, one of the most graphic indicators of Florida's unimportance in this election is the seating chart of the Democratic National Convention. It's still available online. You can look at it. The delegates from the swing states, the blue wall, Georgia, Arizona, they're all sitting right in the front, right in front of the stage so they can see the whole show. The Florida delegation is at the far back of the auditorium. And that tells you what Democrats think about Florida. So I would argue it's really time for Democrats now to get over their fear of Florida and over their fear of alienating Cuban American constituency in Florida. Not that Democrats should ignore Cuban Americans, but they've got to do the basic spade work on the ground of convincing this constituency that they care about it, that they recognize it, that they hear it, and that they're willing to actually do things that are in the interests of Cuban Americans. And that's those top 3 or 4 issues on the agenda rather than the issue of Cuba per se. So it's time, I think, for Democrats to craft a Cuba policy that really reflects the national interest of the United States rather than the narrower interest of conservative Cuban Americans in Little Havana. Thanks.
As someone from the Montana delegation to DNC who always had great seat locations, I can't really confirm or deny that that has any indication. Anyway, with that, we will now turn to Dr. Ernesto Dominguez.
Oh, hello. It's a pleasure to be here sharing this panel with so distinguished scholars with whom I have met quite a few times. I have shared a few panels both in Cuba and the US, and I hope that we keep doing that for the foreseeable future, because there is a lot of things to discuss, especially when we look at United States elections and the role of different communities within those elections and the different states. I think this is an issue that is essentially followed by the entire world. For example, I have been for the last few weeks before going to Stanford in Hungary, and here as well in other places in Europe, there's a lot of people following that and tracking these elections and doing conference and panels about it. But in Cuba, and being a Cuban who lives in Cuba, this is particularly relevant given the impact that U.S. policies have on the day-to-day life of the Cuban people. And in this context, what both Guillermo and Bill have talked about is particularly relevant, because what we are seeing here is that, and I agree with this idea, on the one hand, Florida is no longer a swing state, or apparently all the data indicates that Florida is no longer a swing state. It's becoming very clear that it has turned into a red state. That there may be some changes, of course, in the future, because nothing of the sort is set in stone. But at the very least, as of now, I think it's very safe to say that it's essentially a red state. In fact, Guillermo was saying that he lived in a Republican world or something like that. So it's kind of the same. It's the same idea. It's what is the environment within which this community evolved, which, by the way, is probably one of the factors why the Cuban American community has evolved in the last few years back into being a solidly Republican community among those who are actually politically engaged, of course. Because, and this is a point that I think is important, I want to highlight this in what was said before. There is a direct connection, but it's a two-way connection between this the social basis of politics in the community, the voting blocks, and all of that, and the ways in which these people are socialized, politically speaking, in which environment they live, which kind of political discourse they consume, the work of the so-called social media, and have shaped perceptions and behaviors among people. And you can also, the role of influencers in all of this have created a context in which, especially for new arrivals, and that's something that is interesting in the data shown by the Cuba poll, the recent arrivals, even when the number of areas they have a somewhat, I'm gonna use this expression, more softer maybe, or somewhat a more somewhat closer to a democratic approach to a number of policy issues. In some senses, when it comes to Cuba policy, they are tougher, or at the very least, so they express like a tougher view than some of not the eldest ones, but somewhat in between cohorts of immigrants at different moments, which is very interesting to me as a phenomenon. Because on the one hand, there is a fact that these people came from Cuba, have a relative in Cuba. They know the effects of these kind of policies firsthand, but at the same time, you have this kind of reactions. There is a few ways to explain that, and I don't think there is a simple one. On the one that you can actually attach it to, for example, how these people can have frustrations, and they express discontent they may have because of the conditions in which they left their own country. I'm talking about the economic crisis and who they blame for that. But also, I think it's important to understand that the way in which they get there and they socialize and they enter in this context in which there is a very intense polarization ongoing, and there is a very intense, I will say, pro-Republican environment, especially in media and in this in the ways in which they understand or they learn about U.S. politics and all these conditions. I think this is somehow, let's put it this way, conditioning the way in which they identify themselves politically when they get into the United States. And this is relevant because in many ways, when we are looking at this and try to understand how the Cuban-American community is a factor in U.S. politics, in U.S. elections, U.S. politics, etc., I think there are a few problems with that, a few problems that we should address, and most of them have been addressed so far, of course. But there is a number of them that I think are particularly relevant. On the one hand, there is this dynamic within the community and how these communities' views are shaped by these interactions. We cannot lose track of that because there is this tendency among some people to believe that the Cuban American community and the positions is the main driver of U.S. policy towards Cuba and even towards Latin America. And that is, I think, have been shown to be absolutely incorrect. It's not that it is irrelevant, it's that it's far more complex, and the government positions and policy shaped this the position within the community as well, and all that. Also, I think there is something else. The ways in which some, especially new arrivals, I don't know, I will have to look into all the arrivals, but the newer arrivals, the labels that are used to identify certain aspects and certain policies may be a little bit confusing and may be a little bit of a problem when understanding what they support in different moments. Because if you look into the data, even when there is no question about it, a strong Republican, all of that, there is certain mismatch between support for broader labels like embargo/blockade and some of the specific policies within those. Talking about selling food, possibly exporting food and medicine to Cuba, stuff like that. Not that it's a total mismatch, but there is somewhat of a mismatch. In the like, if there is not exactly understanding of this, that the policy that is called in the United States embargo, what is called in Cuba blockade, entails a number of things in practice. I'm not only talking about what is written in the books, that there are some ways to export items to Cuba within those categories, but the actual fact that except for some food items, essentially nothing else have been exported to Cuba for many, many years, and the other impacts. And even I have had this conversation with some people. They say, "Oh, what the U.S. has against Cuba is not a blockade; it is an embargo," and that they attached a different meaning to the word embargo when compared to the uses that the word blockade has in Cuba, for instance. That will be an interesting conversation to have, what they understand by these broad topics and how they connect that to specific policies, and how that reflects into their political identification and their political behavior when it comes to the Cuba issue. But then there is a point in which the Cuba issue is not essentially an important issue in the broad US elections. It's not. It has certain relevance in Florida, sure. But then, as you have shown, it is not even top 3, and generally it's not top 4 among issues. And then there is the fact in which I think many politicians in the United States, Democrats and Republicans alike, although probably more Democrats and Republicans, as Bill was pointing at, they are attempting to attract a voter bloc that is, let's put it this way, whose influence have been overstated for many years. And I remember, I think, Guillermo, you published in 2016, I think, an article that was titled, "No, Cuban American Vote Didn't Want Trump's Florida," or something like that, showing that, in fact, the Cuban American vote was not a decisive one in 2016 in Trump carrying Florida, in spite of what was told by different media around. The point is that I think a number of these decision makers or these strategies or whatever are trying to attract this block of voters. And even more important, because we have to distinguish between the vote itself and the political forces within the community and the influence those political forces have in the institutional framework of the state and therefore of the country, how they can raise support for one or the candidate, and how they connect what Alejandro Portes at some point called the Cuban-American political machine in Florida. He mentioned that in one of his works. And those two, which are not exactly the same, should be distinguished, have different roles and they have different relevance and they have different orientation towards the Cuba issue. So there is something to explore there. But regarding the vote especially, there is an attempt to attract this vote following a rationale which is somewhat outdated in many terms, in many senses. And that treats to some extent Cuban Americans as a single issue, as a block of single issue voters, in which the issue that they vote on is the Cuba issue. At least that's in the mind of a number of people. And that, in my mind, is the wrong approach. It is far more complex than all of that. And essentially, they replicate many of the nationwide, the countrywide demands and interests of many, many different groups within the community and the population at large. So I think this is a somewhat convoluted way to say. I think that what the first two presentations that, of course, did masterfully show is that the Cuban American community is far more complicated than sometimes is assumed to be. That is far more influenced by external factors, that they have a number of other interests that are not only Cuba, and that in reality is not all that decisive in terms of how the state behaves, and therefore its influence is largely overstated in that context, which in turn, it implies certain behavior by politicians in different positions. In that context, the connection with Cuba proper is also something to be included in the conversation, because there is a significant back and forth. This transnational concept, transnational nature in the definition of transnational, which, by the way, I don't necessarily like because of the definition of nation. But anyway, provides this community with an external factor because there is a dialogue between both sides of the straits. And that has an influence on Cuba itself as well, not only Cuba towards the United States, but the Cuban-American community in Cuba has also an influence on Cuba. So I would gonna leave it there. I just wanted to point a few things that I think could be part of a broader conversation. Because after all, Guillermo already presents a very interesting set of data that I think supports the discussion. Thanks.
I'm sorry, it's only been 3 years. Eventually, I learned to unmute before I speak. All right. Well, thank you, Ernesto. There is the idea that the Cuban voting bloc is a monolith. I think obviously that ship has sailed a long time ago, but the nuances you bring up here are I'm going to have to think about them some more. That's very interesting. With that, we'll open it up to some questions that have been entered in the chat. And let's see. One thing that a couple of questions, the contradictions. The first question, I'm gonna ask two questions at once. How were the questions worded regarding Cuba policies? You can see that on the poll itself, but I'll let Guillermo speak to it as well. Can you speak about the contradiction between the majority saying the embargo doesn't work while also wanting the embargo to remain? I look forward to an answer there. And then the other question that's similar, I wonder if there's a question of whether Cuban Americans think the embargo helps or harms the Cuban people. It would help us understand the contradiction between attitude towards policies affecting political change and the island's economic destabilization. Guillermo, I'll let you have first crack at that, and then let our other panelists speak in as well.
Sure. Thank you, Jorge, and thank you for asking those questions. It's really too laborious an answer to tell you how the wording of the questions were. If you look at the final report, I have some selected questions at the end. Most of these questions we keep asking year after year, so we've worded them exactly the same, so we get a sense of changes in attitudes that are not based on asking questions differently. So whatever it is a steady beat of questioning that's been going on for many years. So I encourage you to download the report and look at the back. You'll see some of the selected questions and how verbatim how they were asked. The issue of contradictions, I almost have begun to dislike the term contradictions, because it's really, you can chew gum and walk at the same time, in the sense of you can want if you don't think the embargo works, you can have that attitude, and we don't ask them why they think it doesn't work. There's no, I don't ask them, well, what would make a good embargo to you? You know, what would be the definition of a working embargo? I do know that that's one of the steadiest measures that we've had since the beginning. People just don't think that embargo works. Now, the fact that the embargo exists is an independent, independent decision that people have whether they think it should continue or not. It was established during a time when, of course, in the 1960s, when you could actually, with some bona fides, call Cubans exiles, in the sense that they had left a state. They don't have a state in Cuba anymore. My parents, that's when I came over when I was a small child. They didn't feel like I could go back to Cuba. They don't, and then the politically involved Cuban Americans, there weren't Cuban Americans at that time. That term was only started being used in the 1980s. There were Cubans. Even in Miami Herald, they referred to Cuban Americans as Cubans, not Cuban Americans. And the politically savvy Cubans at that point needed to create an alliance with the state, with the United States. And part of that, the resulting policies, such as the embargo, such as the Cuban Adjustment Act, and several others, were part of that alliance that was welded back then. Now, to say that you don't supporting the embargo, in other words, is almost an independent variable here. That is, that during the Obama years, that desire went down. And why? Because it made less sense, given the change of policy, that the embargo actually, whatever your definition of it working, had any chance of working, because you had travel, you had a variety of big shifts in U.S. policy. So I don't see it so much as a contradiction as the fact that people say, yeah, it doesn't work, yeah, but I want to keep it on. It's now there, while you do have, while you have that, and I think other folks, I'll let other folks chime in on this. You do have, when you break down the embargo issue, when I started asking these questions, it was in the 1990s, when you couldn't send food very easily to Cuba, when you couldn't send medicine very easily to Cuba. So you ask the embargo, and it's a symbolic, it's part of that symbolism of, yeah, we're going to squeeze the Cuban government. But when you ask them about, you ask Cubans at that point in time, when you want to sell food, you want to travel, you want to, the support for traveling, the support for food, the support for all that has been way higher than support for the embargo. So there is a humanitarian essence to the Cuban interest, which addresses the other question that you had. I think Cuban Americans know that there's an impact of the embargo on the Cuban people. The most recent arrivals are the ones that are most likely to say the embargo is working, has worked, because I'm leaving a country that's pretty much in ruins, and part of that is because of the embargo. Now the So yeah, I'll leave it at that. It's not so much a contradiction as two questions that really address some of the concerns of the Cuban American population in Miami-Dade County.
Yeah, I agree with almost all of that. I think that this supposed contradiction between supporting the embargo, even though you don't think it works, is because the embargo is, as much as anything, symbolic policy. It's a sort of keeping the embargo is the equivalent of maintaining the U.S. government's commitment not to normalize relations with the communist regime. Because to normalize relations and lift the embargo would be, in a sense, to accept the permanence of the revolutionary government, and people just don't want to do that. They don't want to, in effect, close the chapter, even though most of them, a great number of them now, wouldn't try to go back in the way that people felt like they would in the early days. Still, it's still a symbolic issue, I think, for a lot of people. I think there's no doubt people in the Cuban American community understand how hard it is right now, in particular in Cuba, how much people are suffering. How much of that they attribute to the embargo as opposed to attributing it to the Cuban government, that's another question. But the fact that they recognize the difficulties there, I think, is clear. Well, first of all, of course, a lot of them still have family there and they're in touch with them. And so they're hearing firsthand what it's like on the island. But the other place you see it is in some of the questions that Guillermo was just talking about. The support for sending food, the support for sending medicine, the fact that so many people are sending remittances to their family members there. Um, so it's a it's a difficult kind of situation, but it's not unlike what we see sometimes in other segments of the population, where on the one hand, you have one attitude about policies broadly and another attitude about, things that affect your immediate daily life and your families.
Yes, I think that last point that Bill was making is extremely important, and somehow was what I was trying to say at some point in my own remarks earlier. There is somewhat of a disconnection between the big label or the big name that carries this symbolic value and the contents under that we put under this label and what we actually understand that means. It is pretty much, we can see across the board that when you look into polls and regarding policy issues and the broad political identification of the different groups within the United States, when concerned from Republicans and who they're voting for and the specific policies they actually support, when asked about those policies, this is, in my view, is largely the same kind of phenomenon that is occurring within the community regarding these topics that are relevant for the community, maybe not, or essentially not for most of the people in the country, but here we can see an expression of that the reality of this disconnection between those two things. Not a full complete disconnection, but a degree of disconnection between those two things, and the ways in which political identities and identifiers operate in the decision making of people, and the way in which they accept or support one another policy proposal or one another let's say general or even state policy to some extent. Because in here, when they're talking about Cuba, in fact, that is like in any other topic, I will say, but in the case of Cuba, I think there are multiple levels that we need to actually consider. One of them that is the underlying state policy, which is driving any specific policy towards Cuba, which is there is an attempt to change Cuba, the political regime in Cuba, and restore a sort of relation between Cuba and the United States at some point before 1959. And on top of that, you built the rest of everything, including the use of the embargo/blockade and other specific policies, or going the Rama way, which was a more engaging, but then trying to change the country through different means, or engaging with the private sector. All of that can be also connected to this, because there is, when the community, this idea that Cuba have to change one way or the other, and there is a very much structural axis there in which all the different groups and within the community essentially articulate with and they generate this kind of view. So I think this is expressing this the complexities of this interaction. Sorry, I'm using kind of weird words, but it's more or less what I think is going on. And that is also connected to, in some sense, to the denial or the refusal of some to understand the actual role that the blockade/embargo plays in especially the economic and social issues within Cuba and even its political implications within Cuba, because that's also part of the conversation, how this is often neglected or explicitly denied by a number of people by attributing most, if not all, the problems that the Cuban has to other sources, namely the Cuban government or the system in Cuba, et cetera, and refuse to accept this one as part. This is also part of the conversation, I think.
Any follow-up comments? Anybody? Okay. The next question I've got here is, does anyone have insights on why recent Cuban immigrants, at least in the past 8 years since Trump started his first campaign, support a presidential candidate who demonizes immigrants? Do Cuban immigrants on an individual basis think that Trump isn't speaking of them? Do they not think it will impact them or their friends still in Cuba?
Take it, Bill.
So, I mean, this is a tough question because it does seem like a contradiction, doesn't it? On the one hand, well, we've seen this not just among Cuban Americans, but actually among other segments of the Latino community, um, a a feeling that people who are coming on an irregular basis shouldn't be doing that, particularly people who came legally and particularly if they had to wait in order to gain entry, feel like the people who are coming now and just showing up at the southern border are sort of jumping the fence, if you will. The other issue, of course, is that Cuban there's always been a kind of a divide ever since the Mariel boat lift in 1980 between Cuban Americans who were already here, particularly ones who had either they were upper middle class when they came or they got themselves established, being a little wary of people coming anew who were perhaps lower class when they arrived, who were perhaps darker in their skin color when they arrived, um, and who were putting some stress on social services in the community. And so there was kind of a reaction back against that. So I think that's sort of a natural kind of phenomenon. Why these Cuban Americans support Donald Trump, I think we see the answer in the FIU poll. They're Republicans, and Republican partisanship has become almost part of the Cuban American identity. The Democrats just are few and far between in terms of in the community, organizing in the community, really being, part of the political life of the Cuban American community. And Democrats have no one to blame but themselves for that.
Okay, if I may, I want to add a couple of comments on that. On the one hand, I think is what Bill is saying is right. There is this kind of what he's saying doesn't affect me. Actually, I'm no longer one of those that he's talking about. And in the case of the Cuban Americans, there is a long tradition of not looking at themselves. I'm not talking about each individual as a Cuban, but not necessarily as a Latino, and that makes a difference sometimes in this conversation. Also, at some point, we're talking about why supporting Trump. I did some, let's say, qualitative work at different moments, and many of the reasons, or a major reason why many Cubans support the Republicans and Trump in particular is because their perception that with them and with Trump, their economic situation is better than with other potential governments, including Democrats. And that's, as we saw in the numbers, is the number one concern, as an issue, is the number one concern of the community, which is essentially something that happens across the board among American voters. So that has to be considered, as it has to be considered the ways in which, especially the new arrivals, which are the ones in the question, the ones the question is about, they socialize politically in that context, but the socialization never didn't start necessarily when they got to Miami. Let's using as a main destination. It began before they left for many of them, through social media, contact with people that were already in Miami. So they have been socialized politically regarding U.S. Domestic politics and its policies and foreign policy and all of that, with perceptions formed essentially from Miami itself that have crossed the strait through this new media and have shaped in many ways their views, which is something that as a professor in Cuba, I have seen among some, not all, not the majority, not even the majority, but I've seen among my own students at some point. I have had students in the classroom, some of which have emigrated afterwards, that said that they support Trump. Being Cubans in Cuba, not American citizens whatsoever. So imagine when they get to the United States. This is due to the ways in which they perceive and they learned about this reality and what this political processes.
Let me add something to this discussion. I didn't want to lead it off because my caustic remarks might shape the response of the others. But I think that on the one hand, like Ernesto said, the Cuban Americans have good reason to think of themselves differently than other immigrant groups. They've been treated by the United States government differently than the other immigrant group, other Latino groups. I mean, the U.S. government has created the Cubans it deserves in many ways because it has treated the Cuban. So yes, the Cuban Americans do not. But let me say that also the partisan issue, like that Professor Leo Graham mentioned, is true in spades. That is, Donald Trump has managed to all of us to make us think that this election is about him. So we word everything about, supporting Trump, this and that, but he's part of the Republican Party. The Cubans, if you had any Republican running in the United States right now, the Cubans, I would bet money Cuban Americans would support him 60+%, him or her, 60+%, unless you have, unless there's some compelling reason. Obama the first time around didn't get the Cuban vote. He didn't get it the second time around, but he got a lot more. So I think there is a plasticity to that vote, but partisanship is always very important in the Cuban American population. Also, one thing that always gets to me is Trump is not a Cuban phenomenon, right? You ask about why do Cuban Americans support Trump? Ask the people in West Virginia living in trailers why they support Trump. I mean, Trump is a social phenomenon nationwide. He's made it all about him, but remember that it's a party that's also supporting him. And I think that means a lot within the Cuban American population, regardless. I mean, Trump has managed to insult just about everybody in the United States at one point or another, and half the country supports him. So it's not a Cuba issue. It's not, Cubans aren't weird in this. It's a social issue that the United States political system is going through now, where you have a party's representation, a party represented by somebody that, yes, clearly has said things that should not be accepted by people that consider themselves to be immigrants as well.
Interesting that polarization reaches through the communities. Let me ask you if someone, we only got a few minutes left, but so if someone could touch on the battleground states poll that came out last month, and then what if Harris was to win, but lose Florida, would that allow Biden, or would Biden act to relax any of the sanctions in his lame duck period? So those two, if we could have some speak on that.
Well, I could start off. I mean, certainly, Biden can relax some sanctions if he wants in his lame duck period, regardless of who wins the election. I mean, the easiest thing in some ways would be to take Cuba off the terrorism list, right? That's something that people have been talking about. Of course, if Harris wins, he wouldn't do anything without her approval. And if Trump wins, pretty much anything Biden could do, Trump could reverse on January 21st because it's all under presidential executive authority. We don't really have a great sense of what Harris might do on the Cuba issue as president. She doesn't have much of a track record on it, although she did support taking the freedom to travel bills when she was in the Senate, which would have eliminated the travel restrictions on Cuba. And when she was running in 2020, she endorsed the idea of lifting the embargo. Since she became vice president, she really hasn't said much of anything at all about Cuba, which is understandable. So it's hard to know for certain what she might do as president, but it's almost a certainty that it would be more supportive of the idea of engaging with Cuba than the policy you would get from Donald Trump.
Okay, I don't know if Guillermo wants to say something, but I would like to add a few things, if possible. The question about the battleground. Yeah, very briefly. The question about the battlegrounds is extremely important because at the end, every number, every poll I have seen, when you actually weight them, and you consider a number of factors like the potential overstating of the Republican vote in certain areas, which is a possibility, and a few other things. I think the election will come down to the blue wall, actually 3 states of the blue wall. I mean, the Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. That's that's where the election will be decided. So that means that Florida, wherever it goes, and I think gonna go Republican, will not matter that much in these elections and in the future of the country in this sense as something that is driving national policy. So that being said, that means that there is a room not only for Biden as a lame duck president, whatever that actually means. It's a funny expression to me. Sorry. I know what it is, but it's funny. It's still funny. But actually for any future Democratic president, if they realize that they don't have to necessarily cater to this specific bloc of voters or this specific political group of activists in state, looking at future elections. That will be a very interesting scenario for the future if that change effectively makes its inroad into the minds of the political strategists that decide this. But then Cuba is not necessarily a big issue either, so I don't think that there will be any major change, especially when the general goal of the policy remains. And of course, there are perceptions about the reality in Cuba that may fuel the idea of putting more pressure because the country is on the edge of, the idea of Cuba being on the edge of the government, of a collapse of its government that's been around for decades now in different moments, whether more in the forefront or not. So it goes beyond the elections. That goes beyond the Cuban American community. It goes a little bit deeper into the decision-making process and the policy-making process.
All right. So let's wrap up here. First, let me thank the speakers tremendously. I know now I have to go back and review the poll myself to understand it a little thoroughly, because you brought up some interesting perspectives. If there's people who want to get involved, take some action, go visit the ACERE website. Obviously, we're working right now to take Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism list, which does, don't even get me started on that. But we're also, you can also put pressure to increase operations at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. there's a consistent problem with visa backlogs and the lack of regular non-immigrant visa processing. And also with the hurricane and blackouts that have hit, there's avenues to offer humanitarian aid and technical assistance among during their current crisis. With that, I'll have just one word here. I was a little saddened, perhaps, to read in the poll that only 29% of Cuban Americans born outside of Cuba have made that journey back to Cuba. If you are in that 81, 79, whatever the math is, 71%, do it. Go back to Cuba. Go see it for yourself. And I would say to anyone, you don't need, you can help break the embargo by going to Cuba. With that, I make sure my notes here, make sure I'm not missing anything, but I think that's the end. You can, like I said, go to the webpage and download and a set of fact sheets and get involved in the game, and we'll see where we are a week from now. And thank you for everyone for the questions. They were great. It was very difficult. There's probably 24 more I could have asked, but they were very good questions. So thank you to everyone involved.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.